Welcome everybody. Lovely to see you all here tonight. My name is Claire Langhammer. I'm Director of the Institute of Historical Research, which is this building here. It's lovely to have you here today, but if you haven't been here before, please do come back. It's lovely to see you again. Tonight's event draws connections between queer, occult, countercultures in North America and Britain from the 1960s to the current day. We have three absolutely fabulous speakers. We also have a display of tarot-related items from Senate House Library collection, so thank you very much for bringing those over to our show this evening. And we've got drinks ongoing, really, but try not to get up in the middle of somebody speaking. We'll try and make some breaks. We've got a lot to pack in. We also want to find a space for you to ask questions or to make your own contributions. But I just need to say a few thank yous and then I will introduce our speakers. Like all good events, this event is innately collaborative. It's been organised first and foremost by Pragya. Where's Pragya? There you are. Of the Institute of English Studies. In collaboration with us, the Institute of Historical Research, and the School of Advanced Study events team led by Gemma, who was doing all the work and has now gone having done all the work. As I said, it also showcases Senate House Library's significant collection of paranormal literature. And it also complements the Warburg Tarot exhibition, which I hope you have already seen. If you have not seen it already, please do go and see it because it is just beautiful in so many different ways. It is open until the 30th of April. You need to book tickets via their website, but it is just a lovely, lovely thing. My final thanks, apart from thank you to you for coming, is to thank the John Coffin Memorial Trust Fund, awarded by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, which has funded the event, particularly the wine. Now to our speakers. So I'm going to introduce all three speakers so we know where we are. Our first speaker is Courtney Alexander, who is a multimedia artist, writer and world builder whose work challenges and expands the narratives of blackness, fatness and queerness within visual storytelling. She is the creator of Dust to Onyx, a history-making tarot deck that stands as the first widely distributed deck created by a black artist. It is a deeply researched exploration of the African diaspora, pop culture, cosmology and mythology brought to life through a stunning series of mixed media paintings. Accompanied by a 200+ page guidebook, it offers an intellectual and spiritual engagement with tarot, bringing the past and future of bridging the past and future of esoteric traditions. The deck has been acquired by MIT Distinctive Collections, preserving its significance within contemporary esoteric and artistic scholarship. But Courtney also has a life beyond tarot. And beyond tarot, Courtney's artistic practice spans performance, film, sculpture and installation, each piece an altar, an archive and a portal of storytelling. Her work has been featured in the Black Fusion Anthology, the Library of Esoterica, Tarot by Kashkin, and numerous other publications and archives exploring the intersection of divinity, identity, and artistic practice. Born in the small town of Pahokee, Florida, Courtney's work is rooted in honouring memory, myth, and the untold stories that shape our futures. Whether through art, community dialogue, or spiritual exploration, she invites us to reimagine freedom beyond the narratives we've been given. Courtney, you are very, very welcome. After Courtney has spoken, we will be talking with Don Licking, who is in the first year of his PhD, researching the life and work of Bill Butler, a radical gay American poet, bookseller and publisher who lived in the UK in the 1960s and 1970s. But Don arrived at this point through a long, self-described long and roundabout route, taking in American literature at the University of East Anglia, cultural studies at Birkbeck, a very close and much loved neighbour, and a career as a professional librarian. Don's current research interests include positioning queer identities in the context of the British poetry revival. You are also incredibly welcome, Don, so thank you for coming. And finally, now I do have to do some multimedia work here, we have Dr. John Walter, a visual artist whose work explores virology, death and cultural transmission through playful engagement. John's practice, grounded in pictorial concerns, spans painting, drawing, printmaking, sculpture, costume making, performance, video, animation, VR, AR, NFTs, sound, installation, spatial design, curating, and writing. A serial collaborator, he has worked with virologists, Professors Greg Towers and Alison Roger from UCL, on large-scale installations like Alien Sex Club and Capsid, addressing HIV and sexual health. John has been in residence, artist in residence at the Cowley Institute of Nanosciences, Delft, and the Quantitative Biosciences Laboratory at UCSF, and has also participated in the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and doing real damage to the English language here, I'm afraid. And he curated Shonky, the Aesthetics of Awkwardness, for Hayward Touring, and is a part-time visiting lecturer in architecture at the University of Westminster. Again, you are very welcome. And I will now stop talking, which will be a relief to all of you, and pass over to Courtney. Thank you ever so much, Courtney, for coming.
Thank you all for having me. This is my first time across the pond. So a lot of new things happening. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to be a part of the show. Thank you all for inviting me. So just a little quick intro and warning. I'm sorry if y'all have to cue the music because I don't have a timer. I'm ADHD. So I decided to make this presentation as narrative-based as I could. So I'm taking you through what I call the spiral. So alongside Dust to Onyx, a couple of years ago, I developed my own sort of cosmology for Dust to Onyx, inspired by West Central African cosmologies and my other metaphysical, philosophies and interests. And so Dust to Onyx, since its production, has expanded into a system of learning tarot that I'm still developing, and last year, began teaching. So we'll be talking about the creation story of Dust to Onyx as well as this cosmology and system of tarot. Okay, so this whole presentation, it's all the spiral things. And so we begin with my inspiration here at the bottom, the musician Sun Ra, who is, amazing musician and philosopher and writer, poet, who really inspires me in the ways that he moved through the world, being different, being spiritual, and someone who channeled a lot of his own spiritual inspiration through his work and understood the power of story and myth, and he speaks a lot about it in his poetry. And so one of my quotes from one of my favorite poems of his, The Outer Darkness, says, "I speak of a different kind of blackness, the kind that the world does not know, the kind that the world will never understand. It is rhythm against rhythm and kind dispersion. It is harmony against harmony and endless coordination. It is melody against melody and vital enlightenment, and something else and more. A living spirit gives a quickening thought." And so this portion of this poem encapsulates what Dust to Onyx is about. Dust to Onyx is, yes, a Black deck in culture and my study of the diaspora, but it is also homage to the energy of Blackness as a color story, as an energy, as an entity. And as we, unravel, the experiences and the effects of colonialism and whiteness in my experience through that system, and trying to reclaim my own divinity and my own self-worth. You know, I wanted to pay homage to Blackness as so much bigger than humanity, but as an energy that is a vital and important part of this world, representing our complexity, representing our wholeness, representing community and togetherness. So I really feel like he captured that idea really well. So getting into my story. So this is actually a still of me from one of my performances, which I will talk about later, but this is Mvimba. And so I created some poems in homage to Sun Ra to sort of tell the origin story of Dust Onyx. And so Mvimba is whole, void of shimmering depths, an aggregate of infinite possibility, a scroll of memory and potential, born from muck and tar, all told and untold. Mvimba moves infinite frequence, a portal, never a boundary, turns, returns, spinning songs of belonging. And so Mvimba is a spirit that is a portion of my own divinity and wholeness. And so Dust Onyx was birthed from that space, from her energy of wholeness, of love, as a container that wanted to share all things. And so Mvimba's gift is Dust Onyx, language to mirror a reflection left. Divine nations, prediction, reunion, turn back right. And so Dust Onyx was created to mirror the language of Black culture, to not only create imagery and skin tone, but to produce language, imagery, symbolism that spoke to the language that I come from and that is within my bones, and to touch on something deeper, whether someone's using them for reading or connecting with the artwork. And so the portion of me that is Mvimba wanted to give Dust to Onyx the opportunity to be so much more a portal, a language, a cosmology, and a whole world for people who needed a world like Dust to Onyx to exist for their growth. And so it's 78 portals plus one, a hidden mirror, visions in dark waters, 7 revolutions to 9, 16 collapsing to 7, incomplete expansion, forever folding, cars inked in shadow, gilded solar gold, sonic textures beyond earth tone, vade mecum, fishing for truth, casting lines, dark matters. And so vade mecum is go with me in Latin, so I decided to name that my guidebook. And so in the beginning of this poem is more of numerology. So the deck has the 78 original cards, plus an additional card, which is a black mirror scrying card. And so being into numerology and, you know, the 7 and the 9 adding to 16 and returning back to itself in 7, I felt like it, you know, again, mirrored my philosophies about wholeness and returning and the concept of the spiral. And so round and round we go. And so in search of my mother's garden, I found my own, which is a quote, a part of a quote from the author Toni Morrison, and as well as like pretty much what my journey through Dust to Onyx has been. You know, I was someone who had just gotten into my tarot and divinatory journey, and as I looked for systems that I resonated with, there were only a handful of decks that had, you know, expressions of Blackness. And when I looked at the creators of those decks, none of those creators were people who had the lived experience of being Black. And so I wondered why I had a hard time connecting with those works. And once I realized that, it made sense. And so when I decided to create Dust to Onyx, it was to be someone who can inject that missing component into the artwork and move beyond representation as a checkbox and into it as something so deeply layered. And I think that there's power in people who are native to their traditions and to their cultures being able to also tell their own stories and create their own imageries. And the energy that can exist within that is undeniable. And since then, you know, I've continued to grow this garden, you know, that I've found. And so we move here into the spiral. One of my favorite books is on Bantu cosmology. It's by a writer and scholar, Dr. Fukiao. I hope I'm saying his name right. But so in his book, he is Central African and he's from the Congo, and he wrote like a series of books on Bantu cosmology. And so he explains in the cosmology that all things turn into path. And so we're all in this sort of cycle moving round and round and round. And so we began in myths, but myths are masked. Dust Onyx is tarot reimagined through a spiral, a new language inspired by West Central African cosmologies, moving beyond linear narratives. This living spiral invites new connections, fresh insights, and expansive ways of seeing. And so here I'll, go a little bit into the different cosmologies that inform the one that I'm creating with the spiral. And so flowing like the Bakongo cosmogram, this system moves through the stages and directions of living, where time is not linear, but cyclical expansion, return, and renewal. The Dogon cosmology informs its essence of creation, connecting the 22 cosmic seas to the 22 major arcana, each unfolding a step into the greater spiral. The Dagara elemental wheel shifts our perception of the elements not as equal quadrants, but as forces of varying potency, influencing balance and transformation. And so at the top right is the Dakinga, which is the Bakongo cosmogram. And starting at the south, Lusani is where, we are conceived that it's the spiritual world, it's the underworld, it's the world that mirrors our own. And so as we move through the cycle, from conception, we get to Kala, which is our rising or our birth. And as we move through the cosmogram, through birth, we reach maturity at Tukula. And as you get deeper into this cosmogram, the was partially inspired by it. The author goes deeper into what they call the V. So each of these sections has what we call a V, which is a place of maturing in each one of those sections. So we're not just maturing into Kula, but each section has its own cycle of maturation as well. And so when we move through maturity, we get to Luvimba, which is death and returning. And so we're constantly moving through this cycle in the macro sense of the word in our universe, as well as the micro with our lives, with our experiences, our relationships. Everything is moving through a similar cycle. And so then we have the horizontal middle line, which is the line of Kalunga. And so in Bantu cosmology, the line of Kalunga is what we walk as intermediaries between God and spirit, which is like our ancestors and other spirits that we commune with. And so as we live our lives, we are in this sort of expression of all these energies. And there's an artist and teacher named Soul Sax who I took a course with, and he was teaching about the Orisha, and he said that our lives are arguments amongst angels. Mm-hmm. And so we are living out these arguments amongst angels, these entities and energies that are expressing themselves through us and having conversations and experiences with each other through our lives. And the top left is a more advanced version of this diagram where Dr. Foucault explains the 7 directions. And so as people, we walk the 7 directions, forward, backward, up and down. But the point is that we're always seeking to return to the center. And the center is the void of creation. It is nothingness. It is called the dark room of creation. So that is where we go to print our realities and our experiences and everything that we do spiritually, the solutions that we're creating, the spiritual work that we do, everything is created in this space and affected by what comes out of this space. And so the goal is, if we want to be our most potent and our most powerful, we want to attempt to keep moving towards the center, because that, like, everything outside of it is our reality, it is our thoughts, it's everything we're experiencing. And the closer we get to that void, the closest we get to the pure power of creation and divinity. And so in the Dogon cosmology, they're a little more challenging to find information on. And so there was this paper I was reading about their cosmology, and I'm not gonna butcher the details. I'm just gonna give y'all the cliff notes. And so in their spiral, there's, the creation of the Nomo, and in their story are these 22 seeds of creation, and they represent these different entities within their mythology, and they all take part in the production of our world. And so as I was learning about that system and thinking about the major arcana and its association with them being kind of like a higher principle, and kind of, to me, the major arcana are light entities, and the minor are our day-to-day expressions as human beings. And so I felt that it related a lot to the majors, and I began studying and integrating some of it into the system. And then the Gagara is a Central African community, and I was inspired by their medicine wheel and learned about them through a great writer named Maladona Some Patrice, who has a really great autobiography called Of Water and Spirit, where he was kidnapped from his village and taken to a seminary school when he was 11, and then he returned home. He escaped and returned home when he was like 20. And so his story is about being conditioned in, a Christian institution, and having to return home to be initiated into his own community's practices. And his journey was tough because they pretty much were like, you're tainted now. Whatever you were programmed to believe, you won't be able to experience what you need to experience. And so he is reorienting his relationship to his family, his village, his community, his spirituality, and he goes through the initiation. And so after that, he begins writing books to teach about his community's spiritual practices and ideologies. And so within their community, the Gagara will, it's not like what we usually think of the four elements, where it's the air, water, fire, and earth. In their cosmology, earth is the center in the spiral. And then they have nature, which is mostly our greenery, mineral, which is rock, fire, and water. And what's interesting to me is it's not equal quadrants. Everything is expressed in its potency. So when you're born, you are given an element. Everyone has an element association. And fire being the most potent element, if you divided these into eights, fire takes up 1/8 of the quadrant. So if too many fire people are born, then everything is out of balance, because fire cannot exist in the same quantity as water and have the ability for us to sustain life. And so even in their cosmology and their creation story of the universe, fire meets water, water covers fire, creates the steam that then nurtures life through the rock. And through the rock in nature, I'm sorry, I'm losing my word here, and then in the center it creates earth. And so their understanding of the elements mirrors that understanding of the potency of all of the elements for creation. And as I thought about what felt missing in my learning of tarot, it was one, I'm into the hero's journey, she's cute. But it felt too linear, it felt too ordered for my disordered mind. And so when I started learning about these different systems, I'm like, oh, this is like that extra layer, understanding that not all things are equal, because not all things perform the same way. And we need to understand how a thing expresses itself and lives, so we can understand how to tap into those elements, or understanding the complexities of the different cycles. And even if we're talking about a spiral moving in what seems to be a linear path, it is not linear, because the spiral is actually like a breath, which takes me to my next inspiration, excuse me. The artist Walter Russell. And so Walter Russell is an artist, a philosopher. Some people question whether or not he's a scientist. I think the guy's a scientist, He's really into physics and stuff. And, because he was dealing with a lot of metaphysical, spiritual aspects of science. Of course, people disregarded a lot of his work, and some spaces his work wasn't as respected as it should have been. But he used his art, and I was very inspired by his use of his art to also explore, his understanding of the universe and different philosophies. And so he wrote the book called The Universal One, where he talks about, he kind of pushes back against the idea of duality a bit. But I feel like even within that, there are times where I was reading it where I'm like, no, duality's kind of there. So it's within a pocket of the one, And so one of his quotes is, all motion is curved and all curvature is spiral. And so Walter Russell's work showed me how art, metaphysics, and divinity intertwine. His spiral cosmology, like Bantu systems, rejects linearity, reinforcing my vision of tarot as expanding, contracting, and returning. His journey as an artist-philosopher inspired me to map the unseen, to express tarot as a fluid, evolving language rather than a fixed structure. His diagrams, questionable or not, really illustrate rhythmic balance, mirroring how tarot shifts with the seeker. Tarot through the spiral transforms divination into a living, moving system, one that breathes, pulses, and unfolds like the universe itself. And so in his book, Universal One, Walter Russell describes this breathing with the spiral. So when the universe expands, it's breathing and it's cooling. And so when it contracts and it presses down, it's like a form of heating, which I thought was interesting because Maladona Sona Patrice talks about our modern times as like a time of fire. If you're into the Avatar, this is like, we're in the attack of the Fire Nation right now. And so the fire era is one that is, of course, there's a lot of war and a lot of force in not just intellect in learning, but so like a lot more control. And so we have an excess of fire. And so when I'm thinking about our cycles of humanity and what Walter Russell talks about, I also look at how our society is more accepting and open to the occult and the esoteric, the strides of feminism. And, I associate the energy of Blackness not just with culture, but even with femininity. And so we are moving from a hyper-masculine, capitalist system that's currently in this compression, and now is expanding back into values of spirituality, of community. And, that's a whole nother conversation, but just kind of reading his work and thinking about some of the other works I read and seeing those connections, I really feel like, there's so many layers there, and why it's exciting for me to work it into this system. And so this is my spiral system, a living map of movement and return. This system unfolds in 7 concentric rings with the full deck forming the complete spiral. The major arcana follows 3 points of travel, guiding seekers through cycles of expansion and contraction. 2 intersecting lines form the crossroads where the minor arcana walks the Kalunga line, bridging the seen and the unseen, the material and the divine. The Dagara elemental system deepens this framework, shifting focus from static elements to their potency and interplay. Like their medicine wheel, where earth holds center, the system reorients tarot suits, not as equal quadrants, but as forces in motion. Each card moves within its own rhythm of balance, transformation and return, expanding tarot beyond fixed interpretation into a language of living energy. And so as I was trying to create this diagram, I did math. And so, I started thinking about, numerically, if you had a rubber band and you pulled it, it would make this oval. And so when I split each side evenly and added the numbers across for the whole deck, all of those numbers added up to the number 7. And so in the Bantu cosmology, I didn't talk about it much in this presentation, but in their deeper cosmology, they have 7 concentric rings that represent, the micro, which is the person, and expanding out from the person to family, to the village, community, nation, and so on and so forth until you get to the universe, which is the biggest circle. And so the whole deck has those 7 lines. And so then when I did the same for the major arcana, it added up to the number 3, which I, felt resonated with the language of the V. And so, as I mentioned in their cosmology, the V is not static just in its expression through Takula. It is constantly almost like a triangle that spins, like a radar around the spiral as well. And so the majors are with the number 3, a force of creation, communication, and also maturation. So when we get the majors, is usually like a big deal, like it's a big message there, right? So then when we get to the minors, it is the number 2, which is very appropriate with the 2 intersecting lines of the crossroads. As someone who's also a practitioner, like the crossroads are really important. They are portals, to life, gateways to spirit. And I don't know if y'all remember the never ending story with the Phoenix, but it makes me think of the crossroads and the respect that you must have, not just like they're trickster energies that reveal who you are, and test who you are. And sometimes it's, like a laser zapping you and killing you. And sometimes it's a little lighter. It's just like, oh, you learned a quick little lesson. And so I kind of make those associations with those 2 intersecting lines. And so in my diagram to the left, the dots along the crossing points are the major arcana, and then the center is starts with the Fool. And so I have some, a closer look at the labels here. So Lusani, which is associated with the spiritual world, we start with Mama or the Queens. And so the Queens are associated with Lusani. And as we move through the diagram, we have the Kingdom of Gores, which is the water suit. And then with Kala is Papa or the King, which I kind of struggled with this because you would think that like this rising would be like the pages, like this, representing a new seed energy. But with Kala being fire and the underlying element of the Kings also being a fire element, they are not so much about birth just in our understanding of it, but like the process of creation of water and fire meeting. And then as we get into living and breathing, living energies, and we go through the fire through to the nights, or what I call youngins, and dust to onyx. And so they're between, the kingdom of fire and the kingdom of air, which is the blades. And so we're living, we're growing, we have our intellect, communicating and having these experiences in reality. And then we go down to the pages, and they're associated with Lavimba, which is death, and the kingdom of coins. And so I felt like it was appropriate that the pages, even though they are considered the younger people of the minors, to be associated with death, because death is the time where seeds drop before the next season. And so the pages as messengers, to me, are those dropping seeds. And so associating them with death and earth and opportunities to get messages of growth or whatever the cards are telling you, in context of your reading, it felt really appropriate to put them in association with Lavimba. And so we have the spiral. And so Tarot through the Spiral embodies the eternal cycle of growth, integration, and return. The major arcana spiral outward, while the minor arcana walks the Kalunga line, acting as forces and intermediaries between higher consciousness and ancestral memory. Guided by elemental rhythms, they shape experience, bridge realms, and move us through the ever-flowing river of existence. And so my spiral begins with the emerging one, or the Fool, in the center. And as we spin around, starting with Lusani, we go to the Conjurer and, go around the spiral, the Shaman, which is the High Priestess, the Empress, and going on and so forth until we reach the universe back in Lusani at the southern point. And so, like I was saying before, we're constantly in this expansion and contraction through the major arcana, and looking at it through this spiral, even though there is somewhat of a linear path or a consecutive path in the spiral, when you look at how spirals actually move, those rings are constantly touching as a thing, like thinking of a slinky, you know, and how it's expanding and contracting, but those rings touch and intersect and interact with each other. So those energies in the experience of the spiral are also doing the same. So despite how the diagram looks, the actual relationship between the major arcanas in a non-linear fashion becomes more apparent through a spiral diagram. And so the diagram to the right is the line of Kalunga, and as we talked about, there's the 7 directions. This is a very, very simplified version, but I think of the minor, like, they're this kind of wavy line here. They're like the ripples. And so as we are walking through life and living through the minor arcana and expressing ourselves through all of the themes that they embody, there's a ripple effect in the spiritual world. So whatever we are doing in our reality here is being encoded into the spiritual world, and everything that is continuing to be produced from that is, you know, a byproduct of our actions here. And so it is to not only exemplify the relationship of the minor arcana with our, you know, lived reality, but the effects of it, and how, you know, within the Bantu cosmology, we are constantly moving through these scrolls of time. There's nothing new under the sun, and everything is built into itself. And so we're always expressing something that has once existed before in some capacity or another. And so the minor arcana through this sort of diagram represents like the complexities of that sort of movement. And so that is what I have about Dust to Onyx. And so a little bit about me. I'm an artist, a storyteller, a world maker. My work is a return through self, through spirit, through memory, always pulling towards wholeness. I move like the spiral from exploring how my body moves through this world to creating Dust to Onyx as a language of spirit and blackness, to embodying God is, which I'll talk a little bit more about, as an act of radical love and reverence. And so every piece, every world, and every moment is a bridge between the past and future, seen and unseen, self and collective. And so here, with some of my previous work outside of Dust to Onyx, the common thread through everything that I create is this sort of returning to wholeness that I am exploring. And it began as me exploring my identity as a fat Black woman, and to live at like multiple marginalized intersections, and to even be within a fringe within those intersections, to be fat but not have the acceptable body type, to be Black but be too dark, you know, to be queer but not queer in a particular way, and to be woman but not be a woman in whatever is the appropriate way I should be a woman. Is like, where in the world do I find validation or affirmation? And so my life has been me creating my own story, my own mythology, to create my validation for myself. And so to do that, like, I grew up Christian, and so I had a lot of experiences with, you know, the challenges of feeling like a forever sinner who was unworthy, and then feeling unworthy through the identities that I had, unworthy through my experiences. And so I wanted to create a system of worthiness for myself. And so my work has moved from the exploration of my physical experiences into these spiritual spaces. And so Dust to Onyx has been within that journey. And since Dust to Onyx, I developed a performance and short film called God Is, where I build an altar to myself. And, you know, people, you know, leave me offerings, which was a very challenging thing, you know, because, oh man, like, I was really deep in the church, y'all. So I still had that, like, oh my gosh, you know, feeling about doing something so blasphemous, but also the experience of allowing myself to be reverenced and not feel like I have to perform, sitting there in, you know, this costume that I made is inspired by masquerades calling down my own divinity, but inside still being this person that's like, what do I do? How do I perform? What should I say? And this and that. And I'm also like in dialogue with myself, like, oh no, the point is to just be. And having to force myself in this radical way to just be. And so part of the performance people don't see is that I also do land offering. I also consecrate the spaces that the people step through before getting to me. And so it's also, I'm still in the process at like thinking about what it means to be a God, and the responsibilities of being a God is also putting back into the world. It is not a expression of me elevating myself above others, but being a reflection of a representation of God that we don't get to see. We only get to see God represented by one type of identity. And so what does it mean when someone can see God in me, you know? And I continue that work through, you know, exploring now, writing, and it's not in this slide here, but, you know, if you're wondering what's next, it's writing and doing a series of stories and artwork about my hometown of Pahokee, Florida, which is a very small town off of Lake Okeechobee. And it is becoming a ghost town because it was once a refuge, an agricultural refuge for a lot of Black and brown people, especially in the South, who were still, you know, like my grandparents, you know, were still in Georgia working cotton fields, picking cotton, and still they ran away from the farm they were working on. They burnt their home down, and you know, they had to leave town, and Pahokee was a refuge for a lot of people. And so it was once thriving. It was a part of the Chitlin circuit. B.B. King has been there. James Brown actually picked beans in the fields of Pahokee. You know, there's been so many musicians and NFL players who actually come from Pahokee, and it's called the Muck because it has some of the richest soil, and they could literally grow anything there. People would come and get the dirt and take it back with them. So it is, Muck City is, and that muck birthed me. And so I'm a representation of the muck. And so as I explore my divinity, I explore the muck goddess through the storytelling of my hometown. And I'm sharing this to get to the point of how all of this work ultimately connects to story and conserving story and being intentional about the stories that we pass on. Because as I think about my hometown disappearing, as I think about our current reality with AI and the questioning of what information can we trust, I think about the indigenous practices of oral storytelling that were not dependent on, you know, hard facts. It was people saying like, this is the essence of who we were. This is the era these persons existed in. This is what we believed in, and these are the parables that inform who we are. And passing on the essence of a thing through fiction and storytelling, and that feeling powerful, and a practice that I would like to return to through continuing this work. So everything that you're seeing and experience, not just with Dust the Onyx, is a part of like a bigger ongoing picture. So thank you so much for having me and listening to my dedicated. So now over to Don. Thank you, Don.
Right. So this story begins in Treadwell's bookshop down the road. A few years ago, I spotted a copy of this book in their rare books cabinet. Its distinctive white, red and gold cover is unique for a tarot book, using not a standard tarot image, but this rather bizarre 18th century engraving of the Wicker Man. Clearly there was something going on here, more than met the eye. Little digging revealed that Bill Butler was a gay American poet who had lived in Brighton, the town I'd moved to not long before. I found out that he had run a bookshop in the 1960s near Brighton Station called The Unicorn. He lived with an actor called Michael Hughes. I eventually tracked down some of his poetry and a battered but inexpensive paperback version of the tarot book, and now I'm doing a PhD on his life and work. That serves me right. It contains swear words, sex, drugs and suicide references, and some random exclusionary radical feminists. So, there we go. You don't have to read much about the queer poet and bookseller Bill Butler to know that he was a man of strong and often controversial opinions. The opening lines of the Definitive Tarot bear this out. As a tarot handbook, Butler's is well researched and readable. The bulk of the book is taken up with an exhaustive interpretation of the cards. Unlike most other tarot books, he bases these explanations not on just one tarot deck, but 9, as listed in the handout I've given you. To add to this complexity, the description of each card quotes from up to 20 tarot authors, ranging from better known such as Stuart Kaplan and Paul Hewson, to the lesser known such as Tyrrens and Maya Ananda. Butler's aim in this book, as it was in his publishing and book selling, was to make esoteric and even forbidden information easily available to a wide range of people, to effect real change in their lives. And in the final section he says, having learned the systems and memorised the cards, I suggest you design your own deck. Published in the UK by Ryder in 1975, the main competitor that year was the Tarot, a coffee table book by Richard Cavendish, otherwise known as the editor of the highly influential magazine come encyclopedia Man, Myth and Magic. It's a glossy and lavishly illustrated book, very well written and researched, but much greater emphasis on illustrations. And publishers clearly had faith in Butler's work. There was a simultaneous publication in the States by Shotgun Books, renamed Dictionary of the Tarot, and the reviews were good. And there were 2 subsequent editions of both books, both UK and American editions, in 1980, 1977, 80, and 87. And there's even a Spanish translation. So, Butler's closing words, there are too many books on the tarot. Well, are there, Bill? But to give this remark some context, despite tarot books being a fairly niche genre, when Stuart Kaplan's Encyclopedia of Tarot came out a couple of years after Butler's book, his bibliography contained 1,500 references. So in the mid-70s, there was a lot of tarot literature out there. So, who was Bill Butler? He was born in Spokane, Washington in 1934 and grew up in Missoula, Montana, where his family ran a bookstore. He moved to London in 1962, and here he met his life partner, the West End actor and director Mike Hughes. Having started writing and publishing poetry in the late 1950s at the end of the Beat era, Butler quickly became involved in London's radical poetry community and the emerging counterculture. He became friends with William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg and a whole host of iconic names from that time. Now, Bill and Mike moved to Brighton in 1965. Brighton, at that time, as now, had a reputation as a queer-friendly seaside resort, and it had its own emerging avant-garde counterculture, largely centred on the University of Sussex, which then was just 3 years old. And to cut a long story short, Bill opened the Unicorn Bookshop in summer 1967, the Summer of Love. It was initially intended as an outlet for his day job as an antiquarian book dealer, but it quickly evolved into a psychedelic haven. You can see the range of subjects they covered from these 2 adverts, middle ones from Oz magazine in green, and other ones from Funny Different Booksellers. Right. And it became an unmissable landmark. It's very close to the station, and this mural was designed by local artist John Upton. Butler himself was as distinctive as his shop, blonde, blue-eyed, 6 foot 5.5 inches tall, and unashamedly gay at a time when sex between men had only just been partially decriminalised. He was more than happy to play up his image as a loudmouth American hippie, cowboy boots and plaid shirts and fringed jackets. The shop, its clientele, an unholy mob of drug addicts and sex perverts, according to the local Conservative Association, attracted the attention of the Brighton police. And the shop was raided in January 1968. Most of the stock was confiscated, and Butler was convicted under the Obscene Publications Act. The centrepiece of this trial was a short book by the sci-fi author J.G. Ballard, which had just been published by Unicorn, and this book is still kept in a restricted collection in each library. Though it is published elsewhere, it's quite easy to get hold of. Now, the obscenity trial is a story all to itself. Despite heavy fines and ruinous legal fees, Bill and Mike managed to keep the business going. Their publishing branched out from avant-garde literature to self-sufficiency manuals, vegetarian cookbooks, an unsurprisingly best-selling book on marijuana. Now this was written by himself under the Crowleyan pen name of Hassani Sabah, and obviously with a nod to Walt Whitman in the title. Always interested in the occult, he'll also publish reprints of several esoteric texts. And this is one, a set of Aleister Crowley oddities, one of a set of 5 they produced in the early 70s. Unicorn also published Mather's Tarot book, originally published in 1888. It was out of copyright, so it could be easily republished. And he published this due to public demand for a accessible and affordable tarot guide. Now, like Leaves of Grass, this was popular enough to go into 2 editions. This is the 2nd edition. You see a very small little booklet, which costs, what the price, I think it was 30p at the time. And so 2 editions of both these sort of classic hippie texts, and they used to have a stall at one of the rock festivals in the early 70s where these were particularly high selling. Now, Unicorn also stocked a small selection of tarot decks. Their mail order catalogue of books on drugs and the occult, quote unquote, from 1970 names just 2, the Egyptian tarot and a version of the Marseille deck, which Butler had to import from France via a bookseller in the Lake District. It should be remembered at this time, tarot cards and tarot books weren't that easy to get hold of. Now, we're talking about the counterculture. What do we mean by the counterculture, and where does the tarot fit into this? Loosely speaking, the counterculture refers to that explosion of youth rebellion in the Western world during the 60s and 70s. A very loosely defined movement espousing radical left and libertarian politics, embracing the peace movement and civil rights struggles. Sexual experimentation, rock music, LSD and other psychoactive substances also formed the sacraments of a quasi-mystery religion. Counterculture adopted a smorgasbord of esoteric beliefs, drawing as much on the Bhagavad Gita, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and the work of Timothy Leary, Wilhelm Reich, Buckminster Fuller, and Madame Blavatsky. Now this painting, Christ's entry into Brighton, perhaps captures the spirit of the movement and also, incidentally, the Unicorn's clientele. The artist was John Upton, who did the mural for the shop, and it was completed in 1967 during his tenure as artist-in-residence at the University of Sussex. It shows a throng of his friends and university characters, together with contemporary personalities such as Christine Keeler, who's somewhere over on the right, I think, Muhammad Ali, and Jimi Hendrix is hidden in there as well. And in the middle, we've got Christ, a dissipated Christ riding an elephant, dressed as Aleister Crowley, doing the horns of Pan sign. So what's this obsession with Crowley? Well, Crowley became a countercultural icon in the 60s, typifying the search for alternative realities and ways of living through occult ritual, use of mind-altering substances, and polymorphous sexuality, and obviously also his writings, including the legendary Book of Thoth. And Crowley actually has an additional significance for Brighton, so that's where his funeral took place in 1947 at Woodvale Crematorium, with readings from the Gnostic Mass, the Book of the Law, and the Hymn to Pan. And there are stories of the churches being filled with people sort of trying to dispel his evil spirit afterwards. Whether that's true or not. But as the counterculture began to blossom in the summer of love, interest in the tarot grew, along with interest in I Ching and astrology. And what appealed to the counterculture about these previously arcane divinatory methods and self-discovery was partly the Jungian idea of synchronicity. Very crudely defined, through synchronicity, a paranormal order is suggested in the meaningful alignment of everyday events. There are no coincidences, everything is connected. Now, unlike the I Ching, the tarot was prime material for development by psychedelic artists. Oz, the Australian-run psychedelic newspaper, was well known for favouring visual aesthetics over legible content. This was the cover of issue 4 from May 1967. This folds out to form a poster designed by Pat Dash in a coloured coat. Flip it over, and there's a psychedelic tarot designed by the Australian artist Martin Sharp. It's kind of surrealist influenced collage, but it's a great pop art relic of the time. You could cut that out and keep it if you wanted to. And the descriptors are attached to each card. Gold and pink, gold and pink ink. Now, over in California, the first psychedelic paper, which predated Oz by maybe just a few months, was the San Francisco Oracle. And typically, form over content, that's the front cover of one issue, you can barely read what's going on there. But it did publish quite a number of interpretations of tarot imagery, and this one of Ganesha as the Fool is very typical of the period. The Oracle was also the launch pad for the deck which became known as the Hippie Tarot, named as the New Tarot in Butler's book. T, the New Tarot, was conceived by John Cook and Rosalind Sharp via a series of Ouija board seances. Images from the New Tarot were first published as a selection of posters, and the full card deck, with its Frida Harris-inflected artwork, came out in 1969. It retains the original form from 78 trumps and minors, but renames them all: stones, serpents, pears and blades, for instance, replacing the conventional minor arcana. Aimed at an affluent youth market, it may be the first tarot deck to be published in a gift box like this. The box contains the deck, 3 guidebooks, and a poster. But youth market, don't try this at home, kids. Good tripping going on there. Open your mind. From then on, the public appetite for tarot grew rapidly, as did the number of card decks and books. And there's a reason why the decadent history of the occult tarot finishes in 1970, because so many book decks were being produced. But 1973 seems to be the year when the market reached tarot saturation, and for someone like Butler looking for a way to make a little more money, this may have been when he started writing the definitive tarot. Now, some of you may be familiar with Calvino's Castle Across Destinies. Came out in 73. I suspect Butler would have to wait to 77 to read the English translation. But I'm sure he came across all these. So, James Bond meets Blaxploitation in Live and Let Die, and Jane Seymour as the archetypal Bond girl, Solitaire, the evil Mr. Big's psychic girlfriend. And she's using a deck there designed specially for the film by Fergus Hall that you can still buy as the Witches' Tarot. The Tarot of the Witches, sorry. On the other side, Butler was a sci-fi buff. I'm sure we saw this Cheston Heston beer called Soylent Green that has a tarot reading scene in it where they used the New Tarot, the Hippie Tarot. And in the middle, perhaps the most bizarre children's TV series of all time, Ace of Wands, a psychic detective series with the central character being called Tarot. You can find episodes on YouTube. And then on the avant-garde side, we had a short film by Derek Jarman, the queer filmmaker, better known at the time as the set designer for Ken Russell's psychosexual historical horror The Devils. And this particular short film wouldn't be seen outside his immediate circle of friends for several years. On the other side, we have something that Butler certainly knew about, Jeremy Adler and Bill Griffith's concrete poem, Tarot, which consists of 4 screen-printed sheets and a little historical note on the top. And each card is formed of a sigil produced by overlaying the letters of the scripture. I doubt this was designed as a deck, as a piece of concrete poetry that you sort of read as a visual piece. And up on the top corner, from a Swiss artistic circle that included the xenomorph designer H.R. Giger, is Walter Wegmunder's prog rock album, 22 tracks, each for each of the 22 major arcana. Double album in a beautiful purple and silver box with a cut-out and keyed tarot deck designed by Wegmunder. And of course, 73 was the year of A Wicker Man, which you can say definitively inspired Butler's book cover. Okay, how about the queer history? Now, tarot cards are the enduring artifact, or rather the commodity that emerged in the occult revival of the 19th century. The occult revival that saw the birth of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, various groups headed and inspired by Aleister Crowley. The later magical revival that paralleled the rise of the counterculture saw the emergence of Wicca and other manifestations of neo-paganism. For many of these groups, the study of the tarot could form part of an individual's magical education and initiation. This study could extend into creating one's own personal tarot, but as I've indicated, there were plenty of alternatives available for those without artistic talent. By the mid-1970s, these two tarot decks dominated the Anglo-American market, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the Thoth Tarot. Waite-Smith deck was first published in 1909. The artist was, of course, the probably quite queer illustrator, costume and stage designer Pamela Coleman Smith. The popularity of this deck was consolidated in the 60s by numerous pirated editions and by the publication of best-selling tarot books by Eaton Gray and Stuart Kaplan. And the copyright was re-established in 1971 by US Games, and it was shortly in direct competition with the Thoth Tarot, which, having been first published as a book in the 40s, first appeared in 1972 as a full-colour deck. A little known fact about publication of the Thoth deck is that the guy who was sent over to photograph the original paintings in England was a fantastic flaming hippie faggot called Lee Heflin, not only a member of the OTO, but also a central member of the very militant Los Angeles Gay Liberation Front. He was last heard of working as a short order chef in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Still around, I think. A real unsung hero of the counterculture. But for another way into a queer history of the tarot, we need to go back to the 1950s and the publication of this book, The Painted Caravan, by Basil Ivan Rakotsi. This was supposedly Sylvia Plath's favourite book. Now, Rakotsi was a gay artist of Irish-Hungarian heritage, born in London by a strange coincidence, educated in Brighton. And his book is partly an artist's exploration of the tarot, part divination guide, and part of homage to his Romany ancestry. His Irish mother claimed that she and his Hungarian father were married in a gypsy ceremony. His loose interpretation of tarot history contains what we might call several dropped hairpins. His lightly veiled references to occult male brotherhoods, together with pert little bottoms of some of the characters, and these Cocteau-esque sailors. These were picked up by subsequent gay tarot authors in the 70s. It's an art book, it's very hard to get hold of now, but you know, it's an extraordinary Satan figure in the middle. Now, moving forward to the 1970s, here's another book by Rakotsi, Foreseeing the Future, a mass market paperback guide to reading palms, cards, and tea leaves. This was definitely on the shelves in the Unicorn bookshop. Then we have Paul Hewson, and these are gay authors writing in the 70s. Next is Paul Hewson's weightier Devil's Picture book. Now, born in the UK, Hewson moved to California in the late 1960s. He and his partner William Bast later became known as the co-writers of the Dynasty spin-off, The Colbys. A graduate of Dion Fortune's Society of the Inner Light, he has written several esoteric books, including the one called Mastering Witchcraft, and Butler references him in the Definitive Tarot, and they probably correspond. Last but not least is the very charismatic Leo Louis Martello and his Understanding of the Tarot paperback. He was a central figure in the New York Gay Liberation Front in the immediate aftermath of the Stonewall riots. He was a practicing witch in the Sicilian Strega tradition and wrote numerous popular books on the occult, this being one of them. He also had a column in the Gay Activists Alliance newsletter called The Gay Witch. And then he later went on to campaign for witchcraft and cults to be recognised as proper religions. This is a phrase that he used. But despite all this activity, you have to make a distinction here between these gay tarot authors and creators who were, like Butler, writing with a very general reading public in mind, and contemporary queer artists who are producing books for a particular queer audience, queer reception. So there's a good difference there. But where there's a rule, there's always an exception. And here we have Carl Whitman. Like many hippies in the early 1970s, some radical lesbians and gay men were leaving the cities and moving to communes in the woods and the mountains. Carl Whitman was a case in point. A leading light in the San Francisco Gay Liberation Front, Whitman was the author of the widely circulated Gay Manifesto from 1970, coining the phrase "out of the closets and onto the streets." In 1971, he left city life for a commune in Wolf Creek, Oregon, with his partner Stevens McLeod. And here they are in that photo there. Carl is the blonde on the right. A couple of years later, he was part of the publishing collective that produced RFD magazine. Now, RFD was established in 1974 as a reader-written journal for gay people, which focuses on country living and encourages alternative lifestyles. It's still going today, and is now regarded as the main journal of the radical fairy movement. One of the first issues contains an article by Whitman on the tarot, In Search of a Gay Tarot, which is interesting for several reasons. Firstly, it's one of the very few pieces I've found from this period written by a gay man attempting a specifically gay reinterpretation of the cards. He also references the painted caravan, clearly enjoying Rakoczy's dropped hair pins and veiled references to male mystery rites. His main obstacle in learning about the tarot was, quote, the apparent sexism of the cards, and implicit in this, anti-homosexuality. That's the language of gay liberation from the 70s. This obstacle became a quest. What kind of tarot images would we have had homosexuality not been taboo? What would a gay tarot be like? A women's tarot? What of my history is written down here and perhaps nowhere else? And what light does this shed on my growth as a faggot? Whitman also alludes to contemporary tarot readings as a group activity, which appears to be based on the liberation movement's adoption of encounter groups and consciousness raising. And these themselves were in the process of morphing into the radical fairies' art and healing circles. Whilst after Carl Whitman, gay male tarot trail goes quiet. Using RFD magazine as the barometer, I've yet to find much evidence of any further development of an explicitly gay male tarot between the 70s and the 90s, either in the US or the UK. And if anyone wants to show me wrong here, that's fine. I haven't got any further with this one. The main gay journal in the UK in the 1970s was Gay News, which from the outset adopted a firmly materialist editorial policy. And the only British countercultural contributions to the literature after 1970 I found are some very nerdy articles on the tarot and the Kabbalah in a Glastonbury-based magazine called The Talk, that's T-O-R-C, as in the Celtic metal cult. Now, back in the UK, I suspect that Bill Butler and Mike Hughes would have been familiar with both these magazines, although RFD started a little too late to reach the unicorn magazine racks. In early 74, Bill and Mike closed the bookshop and left Brighton. With a handful of friends, they moved to a remote and derelict farmhouse in the depths of southwest Wales. This was an experiment in communal living with a publishing house on the side, which theoretically would give Bill the mental space to write professionally. Things didn't really work out. During the writing of the definitive tarot, Butler began a sexual relationship with Sue Hogg, his editor at Ryder. He and Mike split in 1976. The unicorn business closed, and Butler returned to London pretty much penniless. He took his own life in October 1977. However, sticking with the mid-70s, we find tarot becoming radicalized via the women's movement. Zuzana, or Z Budapest, was a Hungarian refugee from the Budapest uprising in 1955. After a decade of heterosexual married life on the East Coast, she eventually found her way to California in the late 60s and discovered her real tribe in the rapidly developing world of radical lesbian feminism and goddess worship. By 75, she had formed the feminist Susan B. Anthony Coven and was managing her own bookstore in Santa Monica, the feminist Wicca. During a general crackdown on political radicals in Los Angeles County, Z's tarot reading service was targeted by a plainclothes police officer, and she was arrested and charged under a piece of scarcely remembered anti-witchcraft legislation. An extended legal battle ensued, which results in the fortune-telling laws being found unconstitutional, but that was after several years of fighting. Now, this case was reported widely in the feminist press, and I think it's no coincidence that explicitly feminist tarot books and decks of cards began to appear shortly afterwards, originating in the burgeoning lesbian separatist movement. The first, the most enduring, was by Sally Gearhart and Susan Rennie, the Feminist Tarot, A View from the Dykes. And I haven't yet found the cover of that book. I think there's about 3 libraries in the States that have the very first edition. Gearhart is possibly at least as well known as the pioneer of women and gender studies at San Francisco State, and as an important political ally of Harvey Milk. She campaigned alongside him in the battle against Proposition 6, aka the Briggs Initiative in 1978, which sought to bar lesbians and gay men from teaching in publicly funded schools. In a classic case of lesbian erasure from history, Gearhart isn't included in the Sean Penn Harvey Milk biopic. But the balance is being redressed, and I think this weekend you can see a documentary about her life at Flair. Sally, exclamation mark, is its title. The Feminist Tarot went into 4 editions between 76 and the 1990s with a slightly less confrontational subtitle in subsequent editions. It's based on the Rider-Waite's myth deck, and in her introduction, Gearhart states explicitly that the original impulse behind the book was to challenge the rampant masculinist bias in traditional interpretations, to develop meanings which the cards evoke in the feminist imagination, and to challenge the sexual stereotyping of the images of the cards. In later editions, in dialogue with her audience, she also acknowledges the overbearing Eurocentrism of traditional decks, and suggests that it is vital to be aware of these limitations and to maintain, quotes, our openness to the experience and viewpoints of people of colour in the interpretation of the cards themselves. So there's a recognition of the need for intersectionality even at this stage. How far that went is another story. Other books and decks at the time were this one, Fiona Morgan and Shekinah Mountain Waters Matriarchal Tarot, around about the same time. And you can see they produced this in circular cards to emphasise cycles rather than hierarchies. And a number of other decks at the time and books did similar things. There's a whole range of feminist tarots that appeared from the mid-70s onwards. And because there's no LGB without the T, Rachel Pollack is probably one of the most well-known of recent tarot authors. 78 Degrees of Wisdom, first published in 1980, is a classic. Now, Pollack described 1971 as her Annus Mirabilis, the year in which she was introduced to the tarot, but also as the year that she moved from the States to London in order to come out as trans, and I'm using her terminology here. A lesser-known fact about Rachel is her involvement in the London chapter of the Gay Liberation Front, and is a joint author of their manifesto from 1971-2. Pollack has always been intensely political. She has subsequently spoken and written about the exploration of trans identities through the tarot, and her Shining Woman tarot from the early 90s, I think, but I'd argue this is an extension of her politics through its depiction of amorphous bodies influenced by so-called tribal and indigenous arts. So, going back to RFD magazine, and I use this magazine because if anyone's going to be talking about the tarot, it's going to be the Radical Fairies, surely. After Carl Whitman's 74 pieces, very little tarot-related material in this magazine, until the late 90s when Stevie Postman's Cosmic Tribe Tarot started to be promoted. Now this has, nods to ethnic and body diversity, and also has 3 separate lovers cards to give a sort of signpost that this is an accepting queer tarot deck. And from this point onwards, we begin to see new queer interpretations of the tarot proliferating alongside the explosion of social media and with a self-publishing project assisted immensely by initiatives such as Kickstarter. But this leads me to some very open questions as to why it took so long for the queer community beyond the women's movement to start creating their own tarot. Baldly, fashions change. It may be due in part to the less evolved collective political consciousness of the gay male community in comparison to lesbian feminists. Gay male tarot practitioners perhaps didn't see a need for a change in the system. They didn't perceive themselves as excluded from or stereotyped by the traditional imagery in the same way as women did. Another factor may be the psychic and physical catastrophe of the AIDS crisis. Those who might have brought tarot and other alternative spiritual practices forward were either dead or too caught up in the fight for survival. Two notable examples here being Carl Whitman, who died fairly early on, and Eddie Brzezinski, a pioneer in gay male neo-paganism, who I haven't had time to discuss here. These are very open questions. I haven't had any conclusions here, but there's all kinds of discussion. Which leaves us back with Bill and the Definitive Tarot. That's all I've got to say about it, so questions now or later.
Hello, thank you for coming, thank you for inviting me. We'll start with a song.
Death is riding again. He is riding his big fat horse, faster and faster down the hot, hot hill. And as he reaches the pond, he stops for a while, and allows the horse to drink from the siren's breasts, and contemplate the task before him. In this split second, his mind's eye locks onto the target, and he is moving again. But slower now, centimetre by centimetre, he is pulling the bile up through his new victim, magnetizing him in a riptide and spiking it with his evil heat. So he is closer now. The victim sees him square in the eye and realizes what has been going on. He succumbs to it in this crystallization. But as death turns away, his work done, the Empress dusts herself down from beneath the dead man, clutching strength firmly to her chest.
So, to introduce myself a little bit, I'm a visual artist, and my background is in painting and books, artist books and drawings and paintings, and my work has really expanded into all kinds of things that Claire listed as a way to make a world, and that seems to be a theme of the evening, world building. The biggest part of that has been installation and spatial design. I mean, I can't purport to be an architect, but as we'll see, my work has had to think at that scale to make a home for itself, and the tarot is part of that. I'm also a serial collaborator, and that will come up in the discussion of the tarot. Most recently working with Alejandro Luna as based on Trampoline. I've made several tarot sets, 3 of which are in the Warburg show at the moment, but there's also an earlier one that I'll mention as we go on. And I wanted to put that song in because I've explored the tarot in various ways. To give you a sort of context for my... We don't want that again. To give you a sort of context for my relationship with the tarot, I make visual dictionaries. And that's really where my need for making the tarot came from. At a much earlier stage, I would make books of around 22 images. It didn't have anything to do with the higher arcana at that point, but it's very important to say that I'm a visual thinker, and that kind of recombinant way of telling a story through combining images demanded further, larger memeplexes, I guess is how you would say it. And the tarot offered a bigger suite to work with. These are more recent books, but it's to give you a sense that I'm interested in seriality and hermetically sealed worlds. That's a big question for me, is how do I get the work out of the book, and how does the tarot become a way of mulching that idea, I suppose. This was I don't think I even talked to Jonathan about this, but I forgot, in researching my own talk, I had to go back through the archive, and I found that I had begun by making a performance at Motel de Nowhere, which was the space that my friend ran in her studio. I have a sort of ad hoc alter ego called Shitney Cuntstone, and I think her pronouns shit, but she read with these very, very basic cards that included things that I was interested in at the time. I think I could have put out Widdicombe, there were various other archetypes, let's say. An important thing to mention in that is the role of hospitality within telling the tarot. So there's two elements to my hospitality. One is running bars, so I've done a lot of projects where there's a bar at the heart of it, and the other is the tarot. And these two relational devices are brilliant ways of opening up discussion and bridging between stranger and between strangers, but also what am I trying to say? There is an element of hospitality in the tarot in that I have to play the fool as the reader, and I have to play the jester. And as we'll go on, you'll see it's a sort of gestured form of drag that I take on. And in becoming stupid, I mean, possibly starting stupid, but in playing the role of the stupid, it empowers the readee. And this becomes a very powerful thing. Another thing informing my tarot was Nicky de Sanfal's Tarot Garden in Umbria. And this was a sort of revelation to go there and see the higher arcana become buildings. It's a Gaudi on acid via feminism and her relationship with Jean Tanguy. I mean, it's also it's world building on another scale that I'm still ambitious to try and rival at some point. So that's lurking in there. And that informed the first real outing of the tarot, which was the Tarot Garden. So there's another song here, I think. I think this one just goes on behind me. I don't think this even has lyrics. Oh no. Let's go back. So the Tarot Garden was an installation that I made at Meantime, which was a project space in Cheltenham, which has since become Hardwick Gallery. It's a room in which I play a character called Masonic Yoda. And he's just split up with Orchid, whose head you can see in the foreground, and they live inside a very large book. So again, these worlds are being collapsed. The tarot functions at two scales. There's only two versions of it. This big play your cards right set, and the set that's at the Warburg at the moment. And I think the next slide is about the suits. So the suits in this case were the salamanders, which were represented by gallbladders, which is a very important image within my oeuvre. The nymphs, or actually all of these images are, these are sort of archetypes of the water world. The sylphs, which were planets, the nymphs, which were croissants and cock rings, and the gnomes, which were lilies. And then the higher arcana kept some of the types and changed for others. So you've got Les Dawson as matriarchy. You've got the lovers, which was this kind of poke bonnet image that I found. Julie London, Crimea River. A nail clippers as intercision, which was something to do with Philip Pullman. So it was a way of bringing things in together. There was lots of references to alchemy, the salamander burning, Pinocchio. I think there were Jacobiti references. He's an Italian illustrator that I'm very interested in. In the far grey one in the top corner, that's from Orvieto. So it was a kind of collapsing together of things. I think we've got another song.
Welcome to the lovers, and the stage left the lovers. Without the lovers.
So bad. But these songs were made in collaboration with Cian Donnelly, and then they became the soundtrack for a film that was shot inside the Tarot Garden, which is called Epitome. And Epitome is about a breakup, and everything goes on with the cards and the book. It's on my website if you're interested to look. So this kind of world building begins. This is all setting the stall for the next tarot set. So Alien Sets Club, this is a lot later. This is 2015, this emerges. What should I say about Alien Sets Club? Alien Sets Club happened at Ambika P3 in London, which is a big space underneath the University of Westminster, and then at Camp and Furnace in Liverpool as part of Homotopia Festival. And it was my PhD in architecture. It had a different, it was called, I think it was called Alien Sets Club, examining ongoing rates of HIV transmission using art and design, I think was its official title. But it was done in the context of architecture. It was looking at the spaces of cruising and risk and transmission and pleasure, and the cruise maze as a sort of leitmotif for thinking about how you might make a new kind of installation about HIV that wasn't Felix Gonzalez Torres, that wasn't post-minimal, that was maximal, and not the maximalism of a DIY show, something about complexity. And there were lots of collaborations as part of this. Mainly Alison Roger, who was doing the partner study, which was showing that if your viral load was negligible, you weren't going to pass on the virus, which became U equals U. And so the sort of premise for this is that HIV isn't the thing it was in the early 90s or 80s, and so it demands a different kind of representation framework. And within Alien Sets Club, as we'll see, there were collaborations with THT, with Dean Street, with David Stewart, Let's Talk About Gay Sex and Drugs and all these things, and with Public Health England, with amazing people like Valerie Jellicoe. So it was this kind of rhizome, and it needed things to rally it, spatial design, but also potentially tarot. I'll just give you some images of the show. It's very slow. You can do it. It's going to jump 2 slides. So this is inside the exhibition at P3. You would come in and see this enormous inflatable virus called Pug virus, and then you would cruise various different spaces that were lit with different images, and I'll talk about them. The tarot goes throughout as this play your cards right scale, but also the imagery repeats, and the tarot becomes a kind of visual glue for the whole installation. There were HIV capsids made of cardboard. I think I got my head around the geometry of those more than the scientists had. And then there were sauna seatings, there was glory hole booths, there were projections of films. It was a carnivalesque. And this, on the nearest me, this image is the PrEP curtain, that if you passed through it, it became a kind of immunity portal. You'll see on the very far side, when the show was in Liverpool, it was a much darker space and we could blue light it. And Doc Cotton is a very important card within the card. The ancestor card down the bottom. So this is giving you a context for the Alien Sets Club Tarot, which exists at 2 scales again, a very large size, and then a box set. I've bought them here to show if anyone's interested. There's only a few left now. You know, if you want to email me, I'll sell you them at a great expense. Let's talk about the Alien Sets Club cards, because there was some controversy there in making them. In talking about hospitality, what I'm also talking about is that tarot is a kind of Trojan horse. The format, the familiarity of the format, is a way of inducing a very complex conversation to happen casually. And that's partly through its numerology and its familiarity of system, but also through the images that one can smuggle in, like references to crystal meth through pictures of famous TV show characters, but also through the mythology of the maze, which I was talking about through cruising, with references to Ariadne's ball of thread, or older posters during the AIDS crisis promoting condom use that could suddenly become very erotic introductions to something. I think I'll talk about the suits in a minute. I wanted to talk momentarily about the readers, and it was a big shift to go from me being the reader to somebody else reading for me, because I can intuitively do it, and reading is a real knack of perception. You know, it's a performance, and you've got to be very bold to hold somebody in your orbit and let them trust you and earn their trust, and also provoke them to ask something and have a conversation with you through the cards. So Barbara Truvada was the name for the reader, Truvada being a brand name for PrEP at the time. And Harry Clayton Wright is here playing Barbara Truvada, but also Hannah Eaton, Susanna Hewlett, other people played Barbara. And these are photos during the opening of Alien Sex Club in 2015. And it's a very engaging way to get people into the conversation. So these are some of the cards and the suits. So the suits were the barebackers, the Sarah-sorters, the gift givers, and the bug chasers. Barebacker being somebody that has sex without a condom, Sarah-sorter being somebody that chooses their sexual partners based on their HIV status, a gift giver being somebody that's offering to give you the virus, and a bug chaser being somebody that's looking for the virus. Very controversial within a sort of gatekeeping of the discussion around HIV, that people, older gay men that had lived through the AIDS crisis, who were on the kind of committees for the sign-off on drugs, who were somehow suddenly in my orbit, were very annoyed with me. And it was only through a long discussion that they realised that this was a provocation that was purposeful. And actually, that the mythology of these types was poetically useful to talk about risk and risk perception. And I mean, HIV is a completely different thing than it was 10 years ago because of PrEP. I'll play you a song that was one of the cards.
That's my screen name. Mental hygiene. That's all my stuff is written. Feeling my semen. Sometimes my mind switches to transfer. My mind goes wandering for hours with my eyes. In the drum of your dress, living in scrolling city. I'm getting nowhere, always 3 clicks away. Whoever the phone with the doctor, talking like, why is it the office at my desk with the veil phallus?
So that's from the Alien Sex Club album, which you can get on SoundCloud. That's my gift to you. I think really looking at the cards here and listening to the other talks, it's reminding me how much it's about archetypes, and that in designing a palette of images to talk from, I mean, it's a storytelling. That 78-part memeplex needs strong women, older women, young women, It needs to talk about addiction. It needs to talk about innocence. You know, it needs all these tonal shifts that can go wherever the reader wants to go, or wherever the cards want to go, and that changes over time what the image bank is that I'm pulling on. And in a way, each of the sets of cards that you're seeing is a cross-section through my brain at the time of making. And that will become more apparent later on. Oh no, it's not going to play again, is it? Here we go. Oh no. The meaning of the project shifted when it was commemorated in a much more grandiose setting as part of an exhibition at the Wellcome Collection called Somewhere in Between. And that restaging with a different production values took a lot of consideration. And so this was how the big set of tarot was shown at the back of a miniature version of Alien Sex Club. But a lot of people only ever experienced this version. And the first version was made out of cardboard, and this version was made out of MDF. That's a sort of a side of the story. So, 2020, the pandemic hits. I was in New Zealand for a show as part of Capsid, which was the project that followed on from Alien Sex Club. And I was doing some readings, dressed here in a blonde wig. And when I got back to London and there was lockdown kicked in, I started offering readings online. And it prompted me to start making a new tarot. But I want to just talk about what was informing my thinking between Alien Sex Club and that new tarot. And it's really memes. So while I was working with Professor Greg Towers, who works up the road, he was looking at the HIV capsid and really telling the story of the journey of the capsid in infection from the cell wall to the nucleus as this kind of nano journey. And I began to really think about the paisley around this time, this teardrop-shaped motif that travels for 1,000 odd years, but is a very good replicator, to quote Dawkins. It demonstrates fecundity, fidelity, longevity. But really it's a cell. It has a cell wall, it has surface proteins, it has a nucleus. You know, this is another COVID in a way. This has been a very infectious, sticky meme. This is an installation shot of capsid. So my pool of imagery was very different when I came to make the Lockdown Tarot, which was drawn in Tilt Brush, which is a VR drawing program. So it has a very different texture to the Alien Sex Club Tarot, and it also exists as objects, really, digital objects. And the Lockdown Tarot was commissioned by Plymouth Art Weekender as a series of performances that I gave between lockdowns, where we were still worrying about infection, and so I had to wear this brilliant visor. And this is just to show you some reading in action. Mostly I'm just lollygagging, but that seems to be quite important. But also the gesture in full swing, that all of these devices of costume and accoutrement seem to add to it. So these are some of the cards. Lots of different references. I couldn't stop thinking about David Lynch during your talk. It was so the portals thing, more and more portals were opening up. The four suits here are the antibodies, the masks, the vaccines, and the receptors. So this stuff is all informed by the virology that I've been exposed to with Greg, but it's also thinking about Dawkins and Dennett and memes and really also retrospectively what Karen Barrett's talking about in kind of natural cultural practices, that this is, everything in culture is subject to evolutionary selective pressure. And the stories that you can tell with these cards are equally as broad. You know, we've got Trump here, who I sort of satirised as the king of vaccines. I don't know whether he was doing a very good job of it at the time. But you also have characters like, to the right of him is Joanna Southcott, who believed she was going to give birth to the new Messiah. And I was very interested in religious memes, religion being a great sort of facilitator of the spread of memes. It makes them stickier. And political zealotry. Also imaginary characters that are developed. Nearest to me, this yellow card is Alfonso Mango, who is a Paisley. But also heroines of mine like Shirley Carter from EastEnders and Sharon Watts. Okay, I think we're coming towards the end. This is my shameless plug. I think that QR card. It's funny how the tarot becomes this way of reflecting on my lexicon, to go back to the very start of the talk, that it's a way for me to abbreviate what I'm doing and streamline it for it then to grow back up again. And what I've done with the new set, which was really prompted by being asked to be in the Warburg exhibition, I wanted to make an AI tarot. I've been experimenting with generating images from my own prompts, but I've also been training my own models from data sets. Because I work serially, I can input large data sets. Say I've got a book of 31 paintings, that becomes something to train a model on. So I'm busy thinking, oh, this is great, I'm going to generate an AI tarot, it's going to be a cinch. But it's very boring. It doesn't generate anything that surprises me. It generates interesting oddities, and it eliminates possibilities, but as resolved suggestions of something, it doesn't generate anything good. However, it did generate interesting border systems that were prompt for me to redraw. The four suits are the paisleys, the particles, the ornaments, and the tongues. And this will be published in May. I'm currently working on it daily. And this is drawn in Animate, and it has a very different line quality to the previous versions, and it can also move later on. I think it won't move if you buy the cards, but it might move as another thing. And so this is the building blocks for another period of work. And it's almost to say that this mulching process that goes on in making a tarot set, and in enabling myself enough of a spread of imagery to tell any story, because that's very important, that you're making an instruction, it's not a language, but it's a system capable of going anywhere, also becomes a way of shaping the next period of work. So it's looking back and forth. So I've covered a lot of territory there, but thank you for inviting me.
Speakers just to come up front so that we can get a couple of questions in just before we finish, and also so that we can collectively thank you all for this absolutely wonderful session. So we'll see if we can get a few comments or questions in before we go. Is there anybody who has something they want to ask and say, ask a question about? If you have, now is your chance. Please raise your hand. There.
Thanks, everyone. I suppose my question is, when Courtney was talking at the start, I was thinking about this word dust, and that had me thinking about Philip Pullman, who then John mentioned. So, you know, in Pullman's work, dust is this kind of universal force that is responsive to human action and thought and object And I just wonder, Courtney, if you could tell us something more about the specific words dust and onyx. I'd love to hear something more about those. And maybe there's a wider question in there somewhere about the scale of a card in relation to kind of different particles that other people might want to take up.
Okay, we'll hold that thought. Is there anybody else who has anything they would like to say, add, ask a question about? There and there. Okay, so is it you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess my question was also for Courtney, because I know you mentioned you're from Florida, and like you spoke a lot about like kind of background and identity, and I think a lot about like race, and we've been in that conversation as kind of a group, and I was just wondering how that sort of shaped your experience and like sort of like draw to create tarot, but also your discovery of tarot. And I would just like love to hear a little bit about that story.
Okay, well, so we've got dust, we've got place, and we'll take this one.
My question, sorry for the last bit, I missed everyone's names, but it was about your presentation, but kind of with all of them, just noticed like a lot of the kind of pop culture figures that you referenced have died. Those years that you mentioned of like 2011, 2015 are kind of big years in my head, just personally feel like nothing to do with anything political, but just kind of that, I don't know, like why did you decide to center them in something kind of universal, and like do you feel like that says anything about that era of like, yeah, like it's a decade like 2011, we've kind of passed it now, maybe we can like look back.
Sure.
It's just I'm thinking of that in the context of the more historical universal ones.
Okay, so we've got, all right, we've got dust, we've got place, we've got time, and final one.
Yeah, this is sort of aimed towards Dom, because you mentioned, thank you, everyone, was really rich and nourishing. Carl Whitman's idea of collective readings, and I was wondering what your experience of that is in terms of your research, and I guess, John, in terms of your practice. You're sitting as reader, but you have these readies coming to you, but that's very much collective practice. And then also, Courtney, you have an experience of this, because I mean the tribal nature of what I know of West African society is like it's a cross community practice. When we engage in these cosmologies, it's not just a one-to-one thing. It's a commonality across people. So I'm interested in how we can bring that back to ourselves.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have 4 kind of areas here. We have little time, but we have enough time. So I'm just going to ask each of you to do what you want to do with dust, place, time, and practice. Probably do you want
Well, starting with dust, I named the deck Dust to Onyx as a reference to pretty much the cycle of like birth and evolution and growth, and you know, dust being where we start from, coming from the dirt, coming from these just crazy particles to solidifying and becoming onyx, and thinking about the stone onyx and its associations across time and its uses across time. It's, you know, had different spiritual meanings, from protection, you know, to like being used in sculptural work. You know, I think like the cameos, or I think of how they've, you know, sculpted onyx into weapons. And so the complexity of the stone onyx and how it's been used along with dust is just kind of encapsulating that idea of us kind of coming from these different particles into these like complex beings. And as to place, like I mentioned before, you know, being from a small town, I grew up Southern Baptist, but as a kid, I was always like still very curious, very spiritual. And so my parents really didn't know what to do with me, because I just kind of, even within my journey through Christianity, becoming Pentecostal, and through my journey in a Pentecostal church, moving from Southern Baptist that's very traditional, very much we go and sing our hymns, say our prayers, and go home, to going to a church where people are having hands laid on them. And it's like, if you ever watch Benny Hinn, like that was the church I was going to, people shouting, people speaking in tongues. And so I had this like very spiritual more visceral experience of God there. And my parents were just like, our child is like what, like they didn't have an authority or control over my spiritual journey. And so being from a, you know, small town that is like very conservative and traditional, and that small Baptist church being like a place that so many of my family members went to, you know, I kind of, I don't know, I had quite the journey growing out of that as I got older. And there is ways where even as a kid, I was growing up in this town that I didn't feel like I belonged, you know, because I was different, you know, in a lot of ways. But then also having such a love for my hometown and everything is birthed, including myself and the stories, the people. I think that informs a lot of how I see myself and how I see my work, and I see the ways that the people of my town are trapped and the ways they've lost. They're lost and how much they've lost, and also how beautiful and rich they are as people, as individuals. And, you know, I see myself in the same journey, trying to, you know, heal things, clear things, but not, I'm trying to see how I want to say this. In this like sort of processing, this process of evolving and healing, not feeling like it's necessary to forget myself or where I come from, to cut things off, to consider something, you know, negative or less value. I think the wholeness is really giving all the things validity. So this sort of full circle moment back into, you know, the mythology of my hometown is kind of, you know, similar exploration of how all these things informed what I've done before now. Does that help answer? Okay. Yeah, sorry, what's the last?
Oh, we've got, we'll
yeah,
pass on
yes.
to John for time. With your time.
Time. If I make the cards, do people die? Who shall I put on the list?
That did seem to be the implication.
No, I mean, I think I choose, I mean, it was sort of implicit in it, but maybe I didn't talk about it, but that use of humour and camp and naffness and popular cultural references is this Trojan horse. It's a way to lure people in and soften the blow of the punch. And so to have Doc Cotton and, you know, Maggie Smith and all these people, I mean, they are unlikely figures that, you know, when they turn up, if people don't know the cards and I'm reading, that brings connection, and that's a great device for bonding. And I think that bond and that relationship between reader and readee is so important, because a lot of cards are made that aren't readable. I've prided myself on making the cards function and playing that out. And I don't know whether this relates to the dust question, but it's something about consciousness and melding of consciousness, if it's to do with that Pullman intercision thing, that I think that boundaries of identity for me are slightly more porous and distributed into the objects and probably into the relationship with the stranger. I mean, so much of Alien Sex Club is about the love of sex with strangers, because it's about a disappearance of self. And that's something that can go on in a tarot reading for both of you, and in a drink or any drug. Art is a drug. And that there's also something in making a set that is about designing enough interconnections between its parts that some kind of recursion can happen. And I mean, it's a sort of Hofstadian strange loop thing where the thing might ignite itself and it is a consciousness or something. And to talk finally about place, I think that for me, like Courtney, it's been about building a place for myself in the world. All the work is about, where does the work live? How do I take control of its context and something like tarot becomes a useful lever for that, I think.
Thank you. Dom, would you like to have the last word on practice?
On practice, yes.
And then we will have to close, I'm afraid.
Well, the group tarot activities were a surprise. When it came to Carl Whitman's writing, so one tends to think of the tarot reading either as being a sort of dialogue between two people, possibly a sort of personal meditation in a very sort of solitary activity. And I think it sort of manifests in the 70s, and these things I read in two ways. With Carl Whitman and other people, I think it was very much a coming together of people who may have been living in isolated areas, coming together as a communal activity and trying to form community through shared sexuality, identity, whatever, however you want to term it. The very sort of sparse evidence is there that they were talking about a lot of things, including possibly having sex with each other at the end of tarot reading. That's just like very, very 70s. But with the women's tarots, you see them coming together to actually create tarot decks and new methods of reading. So I only very quickly touched on it on that particular slide, but there was one, the new women's tarot, which was led by someone called Billy Potts in New York State. They produced, I think it's called the Amazon Tarot, over a number of years. It was designed by a collective, and every card is absolutely different in style and content. You can only see a very small snapshot on the Tarot Garden website. And there were other similar projects where groups of women came together over a number of years and produced their own tarot decks in completely different forms. So the circular form was another thing that came out of those group activities. So that's where that comes in at that particular time. And that was a surprise. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We could, I think, run this through the night, but this is a lovely building, but not one you would want to stay in at night. This is not the night of the museum. So all I will do is thank each of our speakers for just some wonderful, wonderful presentations, and thank you for your good humour and engagement, and for coming, open to listening to what everybody has said. So I have to add that the building will be closing at some point fairly soon, so you might want to leave. Not with due haste, but with a modicum of just haste. But so much for looking at